The courtroom was suffocating. The heavy wooden benches were packed with spectators, their low murmurs mixing with the distant hum of the air conditioning. Bright sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Seated at the defense table was Maya Brooks. Her dark brown skin glowed under the unforgiving fluorescent lights. Her back was straight, her hands folded neatly on the table. A tailored navy blue blazer fit perfectly over her crisp white blouse, the collar pressed to perfection. Her long black hair was braided and tucked neatly behind her ear. Despite the hostile atmosphere pressing down on her, Maya's expression remained calm, composed. But her dark eyes were sharp, calculating every detail. She wasn't nervous. If anything, she was waiting. Across the room, at the elevated judge's bench, sat Judge William Crawford. His thin white hair was combed neatly back, and his wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his sharp nose. His cold blue eyes glinted with quiet disdain as he studied Maya. He was a man who carried the weight of privilege and authority, and he had no intention of letting a black woman walk out of his courtroom unscathed. Judge Crawford's mouth curled into a thin smile as he leaned back in his chair. "Miss Brooks," he said, his tone heavy with condescension, "you're charged with obstruction of justice, interfering with an ongoing police investigation, and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" David Langston, Maya's lawyer, stood beside her. He was in his early 50s, tall, with graying hair and an expensive black suit. His jaw was set tight as he said, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Judge Crawford's thin smile sharpened. "Interesting." His gaze flicked toward Maya. "Because from where I'm sitting, the evidence says otherwise." Maya's expression didn't change. Her eyes remained locked on Judge Crawford, calm and measured. Crawford leaned forward. "Miss Brooks, do you understand the severity of the charges against you?" "Yes," Maya replied evenly. Her voice was low and smooth, with an underlying edge of steel. "Good," Crawford said, "because interfering with law enforcement carries a mandatory sentence of 18 months, minimum." David's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, this case is still under review. The evidence presented by the prosecution is circumstantial at best." "Spare me the speech, Mr. Langston," Crawford interrupted. "We'll let the facts speak for themselves." At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Ryan Keller smiled faintly. He was young, ambitious, and handpicked by Crawford. Keller straightened his tie and stood. "Your Honor," Keller began, "the state will show that Miss Brooks deliberately inserted herself into a police operation, interfered with officers' duties, and created a dangerous situation for both the public and law enforcement." Maya's jaw tightened slightly. Keller turned toward the jury. "We have sworn testimony from Officer Mark Riley, who will testify that Miss Brooks physically assaulted him when he attempted to detain her." David Langston leaned toward Maya. "They're setting you up." "I know," Maya whispered. Her eyes narrowed. "Let them try." Keller stepped back. "The state calls Officer Mark Riley to the stand." A tall man with close-cropped brown hair and a muscular build stood and walked toward the witness stand. His uniform was pressed and spotless. His badge gleamed under the harsh lights. He settled into the chair, his gaze cold as he swore the oath. Keller approached. "Officer Riley, could you describe the events of the night in question?" Riley's mouth curled into a faint smile. "Yes, I was responding to a call about suspicious activity near the old Lexington warehouse. When I arrived, I observed Miss Brooks standing near the scene." "Did you approach her?" "Yes." "And what happened next?" "I asked for her ID," Riley said smoothly. "She refused. When I informed her that she was interfering with an active investigation, she became hostile." Maya's gaze sharpened. "Hostile how?" Keller pressed. She raised her voice. "Accused me of profiling her." Riley's expression darkened. "And when I attempted to restrain her, she pulled away and shoved me." David stood. "Objection. Overruled," Judge Crawford said without hesitation. "Continue," Keller said. Riley's gaze sharpened. "At that point, I had no choice but to place her under arrest. She resisted. And this is all documented in your report?" "Yes." Keller smiled. "No further questions, Your Honor." David rose and adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, may I cross-examine?" Judge Crawford waved him forward with thinly veiled annoyance. Proceed. David approached the stand. His tone was calm, but his eyes were cold. Officer Riley, you stated that Miss Brooks shoved you? Yes. David smiled faintly. And this was during an active investigation? Yes. David's gaze sharpened. What exactly was being investigated? Riley's mouth twitched. Suspicious activity. David raised an eyebrow. Suspicious how? Riley hesitated. We received a tip. David's smile widened. A tip about? Riley's jaw tightened. That information is classified. David stepped closer. So, you were investigating a crime that you can't define based on a tip from an unknown source. And you decided that Miss Brooks was a threat? Riley's gaze darkened. Yes, Riley said flatly. David's smile sharpened. Convenient. Riley's mouth twisted. David turned toward Judge Crawford. No further questions, Your Honor. Crawford's thin mouth curled into a smug smile. Thank you, Officer Riley. You may step down. As Riley left the stand, Crawford's gaze settled on Maya. Well, Miss Brooks, things aren't looking very good for you. Maya's expression remained calm. Her eyes were steady as she watched Crawford. David sat beside her. They think they've already won, he whispered. They always do, Maya replied. Crawford adjusted his glasses. We'll adjourn for the day. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. His eyes flicked toward Maya. And I wouldn't make any plans, Miss Brooks. You're going to be occupied for the foreseeable future. Maya smiled faintly. We'll see about that. Judge Crawford's eyes narrowed. Adjourned, he said, slamming his gavel down. As Maya stood, Riley's gaze locked with hers. His mouth curled into a condescending smile. Hope you enjoyed your last night of freedom, he murmured. Maya's dark eyes gleamed coldly. You should worry about your own freedom, Officer Riley. Riley's smile faltered. David leaned toward Maya as they walked toward the exit. What's the plan? Maya's smile sharpened. Tomorrow, she said, we start the real game. The next morning, the courtroom was packed once again. The crowd was larger this time. More reporters, more cameras, more curious faces peering down from the gallery. Maya Brooks walked into the courtroom with the same measured steps as before. Her dark blue heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step deliberate and calm. Her tailored navy blue blazer was perfectly pressed, her dark braid hanging neatly over one shoulder. Seated at the prosecution's table, Ryan Keller was already waiting. He gave her a thin smile as she passed. Morning, Miss Brooks, he said, his voice laced with condescension. Maya smiled faintly. Good morning. Judge William Crawford entered the courtroom, his black robe billowing behind him. He adjusted his glasses as he took his seat at the elevated bench. His thin mouth curled into a subtle smile as he studied Maya. Shall we continue? Crawford said, his voice smooth and cold. David Langston leaned toward Maya as they sat down. They think they've already won. They always do, Maya replied calmly. All rise, the bailiff announced. Judge Crawford adjusted his glasses. The state may proceed. Ryan Keller stood, buttoning his jacket as he approached the jury. His movements were practiced, confident but not too aggressive. He was playing to the jury now, trying to win their trust. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call its next witness, Keller said. We call Officer Mark Riley back to the stand. David sighed. Here we go. Riley walked confidently toward the stand, his pressed uniform catching the light. His badge gleamed as he took his seat and swore the oath. His gaze sharpened as he looked toward Maya. His smile widened. Officer Riley, Keller began, let's talk about the incident in more detail. Of course, Riley replied smoothly. Keller began to pace slowly. You testified yesterday that Miss Brooks was aggressive when you attempted to question her. Yes, Riley said. She was agitated from the start. When I asked for her identification, she refused. And then what happened? Riley's expression darkened. She accused me of targeting her. She raised her voice and became physically confrontational. David's jaw tightened. Maya's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. Physically confrontational how? Keller asked. Riley's gaze flicked toward the jury. She shoved me. And you have evidence of that. Riley hesitated. My body cam malfunctioned. David sighed under his breath. Here we go. Keller smiled. That's unfortunate, but you filed an official report on the incident. Yes. And you stand by that report? Absolutely. Keller turned toward the jury. No further questions. David stood slowly. His gaze was hard as he approached the stand. Officer Riley, he said, his tone sharp. You testified that Miss Brooks shoved you? Yes. David's eyebrow lifted. And yet, you claim that your body cam malfunctioned? Yes. David smiled faintly. It's interesting that both your body cam and your partner's body cam malfunctioned at the same time. Riley's jaw tightened. It happens. David's smile widened. How often? Riley hesitated. Rarely. David's eyes narrowed. So rare that Internal Affairs flagged your last malfunction as suspicious. Keller stood. Objection. Overruled. Judge Crawford said calmly. Riley's face hardened. That's not relevant. David's gaze sharpened. Oh, I think it is. Riley's mouth twisted. David stepped closer. You testified that Miss Brooks shoved you. So you would expect there to be physical evidence of that, wouldn't you? Riley's brow furrowed. What are you suggesting? David smiled faintly. I'm suggesting that we test for evidence of physical contact. Riley's expression darkened. David turned toward the jury. Because, you see, the state has not presented any forensic evidence of physical contact. No fingerprints. No fibers. No bruising consistent with assault. Keller stood. Objection. Overruled, Judge Crawford said again. David leaned closer. Why would that be, Officer Riley? Riley's mouth tightened. I don't know. David's gaze sharpened. Or maybe because it never happened. Riley's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists. No further questions, David said calmly. Riley's gaze followed David as he walked away. His eyes narrowed toward Maya, but Maya's expression remained calm, almost amused. Officer Riley, you may step down, Judge Crawford said. Riley stood stiffly and walked back toward the prosecution's table. Keller leaned toward him, speaking in low tones. Riley's mouth twisted. Your Honor, Keller said, the state would like to call its next witness, Officer Heather Mallory. Maya's gaze sharpened. Mallory stepped toward the stand, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her expression was cold and impassive as she took her seat and swore the oath. Officer Mallory, Keller began. You were present during the incident? Yes, Mallory replied. And what did you observe? Miss Brooks was uncooperative. When Officer Riley attempted to detain her, she resisted. She shoved him. David leaned toward Maya. Coached. I know, Maya murmured. Keller smiled. Did you see Miss Brooks reach for Officer Riley's weapon? Yes, Mallory said without hesitation. David's jaw tightened. And your body cam? Keller asked. It was malfunctioning, Mallory replied. David closed his eyes for a brief moment. Of course it was. Keller smiled faintly. No further questions. David stood. May I cross-examine? Judge Crawford gestured lazily. Proceed. David approached. Officer Mallory, you testified that Miss Brooks reached for Officer Riley's weapon? Yes. David smiled faintly. Did you see her hand touch the weapon? Mallory hesitated. Not directly. David's gaze sharpened. Not directly? I saw her reach toward it, Mallory said stiffly. David nodded. But there's no physical evidence that her hand ever made contact with the weapon. Mallory's jaw tightened. David stepped closer. You're sure about that? Mallory's gaze flicked toward Riley. Yes, Mallory replied, but her voice was less certain now. David smiled thinly. No further questions. Judge Crawford's gaze darkened as Mallory left the stand. Well, Miss Brooks, Crawford said smoothly. Seems like we have a pattern. Maya smiled faintly. Yes, Your Honor, we do. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The smug confidence on Officer Riley's face was beginning to fade. Officer Mallory sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, her jaw tight, her hands clenched into fists. Judge Crawford adjusted his glasses as he settled back into his chair. His thin mouth curled into a faint smile. Shall we proceed? David Langston stood. Your Honor, the defense would like to recall Miss Brooks to the stand. A flicker of tension passed through the room. Ryan Keller straightened, his jaw tightening. Riley's gaze sharpened. Objection, Keller said. Miss Brooks's testimony is irrelevant. Judge Crawford's smile sharpened. Overruled. He turned toward Maya. Miss Brooks, take the stand. Maya stood calmly. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she crossed the room and settled into the witness chair. The bailiff swore her in. David approached the stand. His gaze was sharp. Miss Brooks, can you state your full name for the court? Maya's dark eyes gleamed. Maya Elaine Brooks. And your current occupation? Maya's smile widened faintly. Consultant. David's eyebrow lifted. Consultant in what field? Maya leaned slightly toward the microphone. Law enforcement. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. David's gaze sharpened. Can you clarify that for the court? Maya's hand slid into the inner pocket of her blazer. She pulled out a small leather case and flipped it open. A gleaming gold badge caught the overhead lights, flashing brightly across the room. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Maya smiled faintly. Special Agent Maya Brooks. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Judge Crawford's eyes widened behind his glasses. Ryan Keller shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Judge Crawford's hand shot up. Sit down, Mr. Keller. Keller's mouth twisted. He sat down hard, his face flushed. David smiled thinly. Agent Brooks, how long have you been working with the FBI? 8 years. And were you working undercover at the time of the incident? Yes, Maya said. Her gaze sharpened. I was conducting an internal investigation into allegations of corruption within the local police department. Riley's face paled. David nodded. And what did you uncover? Maya's dark eyes sharpened as they locked on Riley. Evidence of falsified reports, excessive use of force, and coordinated efforts to silence whistleblowers. Mallory's face flushed. Riley's fists clenched on the table. David's smile sharpened. And would you like to clarify why you were at the Lexington warehouse on the night in question? Maya's lips curled. I was following a lead about Officer Riley's connection to local drug traffickers. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Judge Crawford's brow furrowed. Excuse me. Maya's gaze didn't waver. Officer Riley was receiving monthly payments from an organized crime syndicate in exchange for protection and intelligence on police operations. Riley shot to his feet. That's a lot. Judge Crawford's gavel struck the bench. Sit down, Officer Riley. Riley's face flushed with rage. He sat, his jaw working furiously. David turned toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. Your Honor, the defense would like to present Exhibit C. The screen flickered to life. A grainy surveillance video appeared. The timestamp in the corner read June 12th, 10:03 p.m. The video showed Officer Riley standing in the shadows behind the Lexington warehouse. Another man, dressed in dark clothes, approached him. Riley's voice. This is the last one. The feds are starting to look into it. Unknown man. Then maybe you should make them stop looking. Riley, laughing. That's not going to be a problem. The video froze. David's smile sharpened. Agent Brooks, is this the same night you were arrested? Yes. And that man in the video? Maya's gaze sharpened. Miguel Santos, a known associate of the Martinez cartel. Riley's face twisted with panic. David's gaze hardened. Officer Riley, would you care to explain why you were speaking to a cartel enforcer? Riley's mouth opened and closed. He was a confidential informant. David smiled coldly. Sure. Judge Crawford's brow darkened. Agent Brooks, are you suggesting that Officer Riley was acting as an informant or as a participant? Maya's gaze was cold as steel. Participant. Keller shot to his feet. Objection. Overruled. Judge Crawford snapped. David stepped toward Maya. Agent Brooks, what happened after you confronted Officer Riley? He tried to detain me, Maya said calmly. He claimed I was interfering with an investigation. When I refused, he shoved me against the wall and threatened to charge me with obstruction of justice. David's gaze sharpened. And why would Officer Riley want you out of the way? Because I had enough evidence to bring him down. David turned toward Riley. Officer Riley, care to respond? Riley's mouth twisted. This is ridiculous. Enough. Judge Crawford's voice thundered through the courtroom. His eyes darkened behind his glasses. Officer Riley, stand up. Riley's face paled. The bailiff stepped toward him. Officer Riley, Judge Crawford said coldly, you are hereby remanded into custody on charges of conspiracy obstruction of justice, and collusion with a criminal organization. Gasps swept through the gallery. Riley's face twisted in rage. "You can't do this." Crawford's eyes narrowed. "Take him away." The bailiff seized Riley by the arm. He thrashed violently as he was dragged toward the side door. "You think this is over?" Riley snarled. His gaze locked on Maya. "You have no idea what you've started." Maya's smile widened faintly. "Oh, I think I do." The door slammed shut behind Riley. The room buzzed with stunned whispers. David approached Maya at the stand. "Well played." Maya's gaze followed the door where Riley had been dragged out. "We're not finished yet." Judge Crawford's gaze sharpened. "Agent Brooks, I want a full report on my desk by morning." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Of course, Your Honor." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Officer Riley's outburst still echoed in the air like a phantom, his threat hanging over the room like a dark cloud. Maya Brooks sat calmly at the defense table, her back straight, her dark eyes sharp as glass. The gold FBI badge on her lapel gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a quiet symbol of power that nobody in the room could ignore anymore. Judge William Crawford adjusted his glasses and stared down at her from the elevated bench. His thin mouth twisted into a cold frown. "Agent Brooks," Crawford said, his tone clipped and strained. "I trust you understand the seriousness of the allegations you've raised." Maya's gaze was steady. "Perfectly, Your Honor." David Langston leaned toward her. "They're on the ropes," he whispered. "Finish them." Maya's dark eyes flicked toward Ryan Keller, who sat rigid at the prosecution's table, his mouth pressed into a tight line. "Mr. Keller," David said, rising from his seat, "do you have any further witnesses you'd like to call?" Keller's eyes darted toward Judge Crawford. His jaw clenched. "No, Your Honor." David's smile sharpened. "Then the defense would like to introduce new evidence into the record." Keller shot to his feet. "Objection. On what grounds?" Judge Crawford asked. Keller's face was flushed. "The defense has had ample time to present evidence." David's smile widened. "Yes, but this evidence was obtained after Officer Riley's outburst, and it directly impacts the integrity of the case." Judge Crawford's gaze sharpened. "Proceed." David walked toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. He held up a thin USB drive between two fingers. "Your Honor, this is footage obtained from a traffic camera 2 blocks from the Lexington warehouse. Time-stamped just 2 hours after Miss Brooks was arrested." Maya's eyes gleamed. David inserted the drive into the console. The screen flickered to life. The video showed a dark street corner illuminated by a flickering street lamp. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. The back door opened. Officer Riley stepped out. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Another man stepped out of the SUV, Miguel Santos, the cartel enforcer from the previous surveillance footage. Santos's voice, "On video, you said the problem was handled." Riley's voice, "Nervous it is. I didn't expect her to be FBI." Santos, coldly, "That sounds like a problem." The video cut out. Maya's gaze sharpened. "Care to explain that, Mr. Keller?" Keller's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I have no knowledge of this meeting." David's smile darkened. "No? Then maybe you can explain this." David held up a printed bank statement. "This is Officer Riley's personal account activity, showing 2 deposits of $50,000 each. Both deposits made just days before Miss Brooks was arrested." Judge Crawford's brow furrowed. "And the source of these funds?" David's gaze sharpened. "Both deposits were traced to an offshore account connected to the Martinez cartel." The courtroom exploded in gasps. Keller stood. "Objection. Overruled." Crawford's voice was sharp as glass. David smiled faintly. "Agent Brooks, in your professional experience, what conclusion would you draw from this?" Maya's gaze was cold. "That Officer Riley was being paid to silence potential threats to the Martinez cartel, including me." Judge Crawford's mouth curled into a thin line. "And you have proof of this?" Maya's gaze sharpened. "We obtained search warrants for Officer Riley's personal devices. The FBI is currently analyzing encrypted messages exchanged between Riley and several known cartel members." Keller's face had drained of color. His hands gripped the edges of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Maya smiled faintly. "Shall I continue?" "No." Judge Crawford said, his tone cold. His gaze flicked toward Keller. Mr. Keller, did you have knowledge of these payments? Keller's mouth twisted. Of course not. Maya's smile widened. Then perhaps you'd like to explain this. She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She unfolded it and handed it to David. David held it up for the court. This is an email exchange between Ryan Keller and Officer Riley, discussing how to suppress Agent Brooks's identity after the arrest. Gasps erupted through the gallery. Judge Crawford's brow darkened. You have a response, Mr. Keller? Keller's face twisted with barely concealed panic. Your Honor, this is clearly fabricated. David smiled coldly. We obtained it from Keller's personal email server, under a warrant issued by the FBI. Keller's mouth opened, then closed. Judge Crawford's gaze was sharp as steel. Bailiff, take Mr. Keller into custody. Keller's face twisted. You can't. Two bailiffs seized him by the arms. This isn't over, Keller shouted as they dragged him toward the exit. Do you have any idea who I work for? Maya's smile sharpened. Yes. The door slammed shut behind him. Judge Crawford's gaze turned toward Maya. His face was pale beneath the courtroom lights. Agent Brooks, Crawford said, his tone strained. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Maya's gaze sharpened. Yes, Your Honor. She stood and approached the bench. Riley and Keller are part of a larger network. The Martinez cartel has been funneling money into this department for years, and they've had protection from inside the system. Judge Crawford's eyes darkened. Are you suggesting that members of this court are involved? Maya's gaze didn't waver. I'm not suggesting it. I'm telling you. The gallery erupted into murmurs. Judge Crawford's gaze was hard. And you have evidence? Maya's smile widened faintly. We're working on it. Judge Crawford's mouth tightened. Proceed carefully, Agent Brooks. Maya's eyes gleamed. Always. Judge Crawford's gavel struck the bench. Court is adjourned. As Maya walked toward the exit, David stepped beside her. You just put a target on your back, he said. Maya's smile darkened. Good. The heavy iron doors slammed shut behind Ryan Keller. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, leaving a sharp silence in its wake. Maya Brooks sat at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood surface. Her gold FBI badge gleamed faintly under the cold lights, a quiet symbol of power that everyone in the room had now come to fear and respect. Judge Crawford sat stiffly at the elevated bench, his mouth set in a hard line. His thin hands curled around the edges of the gavel, as though he was bracing himself for a blow that had not yet come. David Langston leaned toward Maya. You just blew a hole in the entire department. Good, Maya said softly. Her dark eyes remained focused on Judge Crawford. Let's see how deep it goes. Crawford's gaze sharpened. He adjusted his glasses, his mouth twisting into a cold smile. Agent Brooks, he said, his tone heavy, do you understand the severity of what you've exposed here today? Perfectly, Maya replied. Her voice was steady as steel. Ryan Keller was a top prosecutor, Crawford continued. He had connections, influence. There are going to be consequences for this. Maya's smile sharpened. That's the idea. Judge Crawford's thin mouth curled downward. His gaze darkened behind his glasses. David stood. Your Honor, the defense moves to have all charges against Agent Brooks dropped immediately. Crawford's brow furrowed. On what grounds? David's smile widened. On the grounds that the arresting officer, Officer Mark Riley, has been exposed as a corrupt asset of the Martinez cartel. His testimony is tainted, his credibility destroyed, and the state's case is now irreparably compromised. Judge Crawford's gaze sharpened. Keller was gone. Riley was gone. And now Crawford was standing on thin ice, and he knew it. The prosecution rests, Crawford said tightly. His hand curled around the gavel. All charges against Agent Brooks are hereby dismissed. A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Maya's dark eyes gleamed coldly. And, Crawford added, his voice low and dangerous, this court is issuing an order to launch an immediate federal investigation into the conduct of the Lexington Police Department. David's mouth curled into a smile. Well, that's a start. Judge Crawford's gaze settled on Maya. Agent Brooks, you're playing a dangerous game. Maya's smile was faint. I'm not playing, Your Honor. Crawford's mouth tightened. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room like a final blow. Maya stood. Reporters surged forward the moment the court doors opened. Microphones and cameras were thrust toward her face. Agent Brooks, how deep does the corruption go? Is Judge Crawford involved? Do you believe other members of the department are complicit? David stepped beside her, raising his hand. No comment. Maya's gaze sharpened. Actually, David's brow furrowed. Maya leaned toward the nearest microphone. This investigation is far from over. What we've uncovered so far is only the beginning, and I intend to pursue every lead, no matter where it takes me. Agent Brooks, Maya, do you think Officer Riley will testify against the department? Maya's dark eyes flashed. If he's smart, yes. David's smile widened. And if he's not, Maya's gaze was hard. Then we'll break him. A black SUV with government plates pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, opened the back door, and waited. Maya adjusted the sleeve of her blazer. Ready? David asked. Maya's smile was thin. This part's over. The next part is just starting. David chuckled. You've got cartel enforcers, corrupt cops, and half the legal system watching you right now. Think you can handle that? Maya's dark eyes gleamed. That's cute. David raised an eyebrow. Cute. Maya slid into the SUV. Worry when I start getting bored. David laughed and followed her inside. The SUV pulled away from the courthouse, disappearing into the traffic. 2 days later, Maya sat across from Special Agent Marcus Keene in a private briefing room at the FBI field office. Keene slid a thin file across the table. That's the full financial breakdown from Riley's account. Offshore deposits, shell companies, connections to at least 5 different cartel-linked operations. Maya flipped through the pages. And Keller. Keene's mouth tightened. We traced email exchanges and encrypted phone calls linking Keller to a judge in the neighboring district, Judge Richard Bowman. Maya's brow lifted. A sitting judge? Keene nodded. We also found sealed court documents Bowman signed, suppressing evidence in cartel-linked cases. Maya's smile darkened. So Keller wasn't working alone. No, Keene said. And there's more. He slid another file across the table. Riley flipped. Maya's gaze sharpened. Already, Keene's smile was thin. He's a coward. He's willing to give us everything. Names, contacts, meeting locations, in exchange for immunity. Maya's jaw tightened. No deal. Keene frowned. You sure? He stays in lockup until he gives us the full picture, Maya said coldly. And then we cut him loose in general population. Keene's mouth curled into a smile. Brutal. Maya's gaze was hard. Necessary. Keene's expression darkened. What's your next move? Maya slid the files into her briefcase and stood. Bowman. Going after a sitting judge? Keene asked. Maya's smile sharpened. He's just the next piece on the board. Think you can handle it? Maya's dark eyes flashed. I'm counting on it. Keene leaned back. Good luck. Maya's smile was faint. I don't need luck. She turned and strode out of the briefing room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. 3 weeks later, the front page of the New York Times read, Corruption scandal shakes Lexington Police Department. Top prosecutor, high-ranking officers face federal charges. Beneath the headline was a photo of Ryan Keller and Officer Riley being led away in handcuffs. Maya sat on a park bench, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The city skyline stretched out behind her. David sat down beside her. It's official. Keller's been disbarred. Riley is cooperating with the feds. Judge Bowman is next. Maya's smile was faint. Good. David leaned back. So what happens now? Maya's gaze darkened. We keep going. David's brow lifted. How far? Maya's eyes gleamed. All the way. 3 months later, the Lexington County Courthouse was quieter than usual. The marble floors, once filled with hurried footsteps and hushed conversations, now echoed with an eerie stillness. The tension that had weighed down the building for years had lifted, but the scars of corruption remained etched in the foundation. Maya Brooks stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out over the city. Her dark eyes were steady, her posture calm and composed. The morning sunlight reflected off her gold FBI badge, clipped neatly to the lapel of her tailored navy blue blazer. David Langston stepped up beside her, a coffee cup in his hand. He handed it to her without a word. All clear? David asked. Maya took a sip of the coffee. Keller pled guilty to obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and collusion with organized crime. David's brow lifted. And the sentencing? Maya's smile was faint. 12 years, minimum. David chuckled. Not bad. And Riley? David's smile widened. He flipped completely. Testified against Keller. Gave up names, locations, even the money trail. Maya's gaze sharpened. And Judge Bowman? David's smile faded slightly. Pending investigation. But Riley's testimony tied him directly to the Martinez cartel. Maya's dark eyes glinted. Good. David studied her for a moment. So you won. Maya's gaze swept over the city skyline. Not yet. David sighed. Come on, Maya. Keller's in prison. Riley's facing federal charges. The police department is getting cleaned out from the inside. Internal Affairs is crawling over every officer's file. And Bowman? Maya asked. David's smile thinned. He's slippery. Maya's expression darkened. Not for long. David chuckled. You're relentless. I don't like loose ends, Maya replied calmly. David leaned toward her. And what if Bowman has more protection than we realize? Maya's dark eyes flashed. Then we burned through it. David shook his head. You never let it go, do you? Maya's smile was cold. Letting it go is how we got here. David studied her for a moment. You know, most people would take a win and walk away. I'm not most people. David laughed softly. No, you're not. At that moment, Marcus Keene approached from the sidewalk. He was dressed in a dark suit, his badge clipped to his belt. His face was sharp with quiet intensity. Agent Brooks, Keene said. We've got a development. Maya's gaze sharpened. Bowman. Keene nodded. He's under federal surveillance. We intercepted communications between Bowman and a known associate of the Martinez cartel. He's planning to leave the country. David's brow furrowed. When? Tomorrow. Maya's jaw tightened. Where? Private airfield outside of Lexington. Maya's smile sharpened. Do we have an extraction team ready? Already in place, Keene said. We're just waiting for the green light. David's brow lifted. And if he tries to resist? Maya's dark gaze was steady. He won't. Keene's mouth curled into a smile. I'd hate to be in his position. Maya's gaze darkened. He made his choice. Keene nodded toward her. We'll keep you updated. Maya's eyes sharpened. Do more than that. Close it down. Keene's smile widened. Yes, ma'am. He turned and walked away, leaving Maya and David alone on the courthouse steps. David chuckled. You really think he'll run? Maya's smile was faint. They always do. David studied her for a long moment. And what happens after Bowman goes down? Maya's eyes glinted. We find the next one. David sighed. I should have known. Maya took another sip of her coffee. There's always another one. David's gaze softened. You know you don't have to carry all of this alone. Maya's expression remained calm. I'm not alone. David smiled faintly. No, you're not. They stood quietly for a moment, the city humming in the background. Cars passed along the street below. The sound of construction echoed from a nearby building. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Finally, David sighed. Well, I guess this is where you walk away and disappear into the night like some kind of superhero. Maya's smile widened faintly. Not tonight. David raised an eyebrow. Why not? Maya's eyes glinted with quiet amusement. Because I still have work to do. David chuckled. Of course you do. Maya's gaze softened slightly. You coming? David's smile widened. Wouldn't miss it. Maya turned toward the street. David fell in a step beside her as they walked down the sidewalk. The city hummed around them, alive and breathing. But for the first time in years, Maya felt like she was in control. As they crossed the street, David glanced toward her. So what happens now? Maya's dark eyes gleamed. We clean house. David's smile sharpened. And after that, Maya's gaze lifted toward the skyline. After that, her smile widened faintly. We burn the whole thing down. 1 week later, the front page of the Washington Post read, Federal agent uncovers widespread corruption network. Judge, officers, and prosecutor facing charges. Beneath the headline was a photo of Keller and Riley being led away in handcuffs, and another photo of Judge Bowman being escorted out of a private jet by federal agents. Maya sat in a quiet office overlooking the city. Her FBI badge rested on the desk beside her. Marcus Keene leaned against the doorframe. Bowman's in holding. He's asking for a deal. Maya's dark eyes sharpened. No deals. Keene's smile was thin. I thought you'd say that. David stepped into the room. Coffee. Maya smiled faintly. You know I don't drink it this late. David shrugged. Thought I'd try. Marcus grinned. So what's next? Maya's gaze was sharp as steel. We clean up the rest. David's brow lifted. And if more people come after you? Maya's smile was cold. Let them try. Marcus chuckled. You really don't know how to quit, do you? Maya's gaze darkened. No. David's smile widened. Good. Maya stood, sliding her badge into her pocket. Let's get to work.